Mario Kart 64 is one of the most fondly remembered games from the N64. While being one of the Mario Kart games people are most nostalgic for, it definitely shows its age nowadays and has been overshadowed over time by future entries. That said, it was my first experience with the Mario Kart series, and thus is a major reason I love the series so much, so it will always have a soft spot in my heart. Mario Kart 64's track selection is interesting, as it's the earliest representation of what the Nitro track selection will look like throughout the rest of the series. You have your starter circuit, your ice track, your stadium, jungle, traffic level, beach, a singular Bowser's Castle, and of course your Rainbow Road. These tracks are the epitome of these track themes, leaving room for expansion on the formats going forward while still being very iconic in their own rights. Today I'm going to rank the cups of this all-time classic, followed of course with a proper ranking of all the tracks in the game. Here's a recap of my previous cup rankings. This is going to expand throughout the series as I update this with literally every single cup I've covered up until that point. So in future videos, this is going to be a lot more interesting because you're going to see a lot more mixing together of the cups of later games, but right now this is basically just a recap of the SNES video. So by the end of this, we should get a proper comparison of every cup in Mario Kart, and we should be able to see what cup is truly the best in the series by that point. At least in my opinion, but that's besides the point. One last thing I meant to bring up in the last video, just because a track is ranked at the bottom of the list, it doesn't necessarily mean I don't like it. There's only one Nitro and one Retro in the entire series that I genuinely think is a bad track, and I'll make it very clear when we get to both. If your favorite track in the game gets ranked at the bottom, that's okay. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. That may give me a greater appreciation of those tracks, because I do genuinely still like them. I've recently especially been super interested in the more underrated tracks in the series, because trust me, going forward I'm gonna have some thoughts on my own personal favorite underrated tracks. In general, I don't really think there's any bad Mario Kart tracks aside from the two that I talked about a moment ago. Every track has something to offer, so I think an argument can be made for any of them, even if I think some definitely stand out a lot more than others. All that said, let's begin the ranking of the Mario Kart 64 cups. So at number 4 we have the Mushroom Cup, and this cup's tracks aren't necessarily bad, it's just that compared to the other tracks in Mario Kart 64, these ones just tended to be overall the weakest batch. Starting off, we have Luigi Raceway. It's obviously the first track in the game, and by extension, the weakest of the Raceway tracks here. It's mostly just a bunch of straightaways with very light turns that in this game you don't even really need to worry about drifting at all on. They're very easy to just take just normally. And aside from that, there is the one hot air balloon that will come down and bring an item box down, but aside from that, there's not really a whole lot going on. The track itself is very similar in structure to Luigi's Circuit from the GameCube. I would give the advantage to the GameCube version just because of its whole gimmick of having the parallel tracks that lets you race head on with people who are in front or behind you. But yeah, in general, this one is just kind of like, there's a tunnel section at one point, which I guess is cool, but aside from that, just not really a whole lot going on. Overall, one of the more skippable tracks in this game, relatively speaking. So the second track in the cup is Moo Moo Farms, which is very simple both graphically and mechanically. This track is basically an oval, and while there are a couple little obstacles in the road, there's a couple sections where there's a lot of moles popping out of the ground. There's a couple bridges where the support beams you have to drive around. But aside from that, it's a very plain track in general. I think the concept is done a lot better with Moo Moo Meadows, considering that one actually has the Moo Moos as an obstacle on the track. But aside from that, it's just kind of whatever. This is a track that I remembered when I was younger, just because I guess the cows just stuck out to me or something. but as an adult, it's just increasingly become a much more forgettable track, and again, definitely towards the bottom of the ranking. So the next two tracks are going to be more towards the middle level of my ranking. They're definitely an improvement over the previous two, but not quite reaching the highs of later tracks in the game. First of all, we have Koopa Troopa Beach, which has a very fun design, and this is one of the first that I would consider to be the N64 like 3D equivalent of an SNES track theme. This one's obviously a 3D version of the Koopa Beach levels from Super Mario Kart. And there are a couple other tracks where the comparison's pretty direct like that, but there's a couple where it's not quite as direct. Like, Donut Plains is the only one where I can't really think of that close of a comparable track in this game. The closest I can really think of for that one is Moo Moo Farm, just because that one's sort of like a grassy landscape where you're driving on a dirt road and there's Monty Moles popping out of the ground. But aside from that, everything else has a pretty close equivalent, whether that's in name or in track design, if not both. But as for this track itself, it's not the most ambitious track ever, but I like a lot of what it does. The Koopa Rock at the start is very iconic. I like how you can choose between going to the right or left of it. The crabs walking around make for a nice little obstacle, as well as the changing tide. And I really like the shortcut through the rock that cuts off a surprisingly large amount of track. Like, that's genuinely a really good shortcut for this being a Mushroom Cup track. You'd expect something like that to be in a later track in the game. So next we have Kalimari Desert, which I'd say it's a good first desert track for the series. It doesn't really do a whole lot special in terms of the track layout itself. The biggest standout with this track is obviously the train, which does add a very interesting dynamic to the track, where if you end up crossing over the train tracks at the wrong time, you either could get hit by the train or you might just have to completely stop for it, which I do think is a very interesting gimmick for a Mario Kart track to have, is an obstacle that you literally have to stop for. But I will say this is definitely the weakest version of the track. Later iterations improve on whether it's adding more shortcuts or kind of rerouting it. But speaking of the reroutes that we'll see in the future, we do get an interesting little shortcut in this track where if you use a star right as you're entering through the tunnel on the train, it'll count as a lap for you, which can genuinely turn a lot of races around very quickly, as I have had experience doing so in the past. But aside from that, the track's pretty straightforward. The train definitely adds a lot to it, but without it, it's definitely the most simple desert track we've gone in the series. Coming into second place for our cups, it is the Flower Cup. This cup has a lot of improvements over the Mushroom Cup, but yet again we don't quite reach the same highs that we reach in later cups in the game. So starting off we have Toad's Turnpike, which is the very first traffic level in the series, and in doing so it has a very, very simple layout. It's basically just a figure eight. And while that does sound like it could be boring, this track pulls it off pretty well. There's so much traffic that you're having to weave around that it adds a lot of challenge to this otherwise very simple track. This version's definitely harder than the Mario Kart 8 version, but visually it's very bland, and later city tracks definitely take more advantage of the fact that you're in a city in terms of the aesthetics. And one little neat thing about this track too is that if you play it in mirror mode, the traffic actually is coming towards you, which I haven't personally played this track on mirror mode before, but knowing how it can already be a little difficult in this game to weave around the traffic, I imagine when you have less time to deal with the traffic, it becomes a lot harder. So the second track in the Flower Cup is Frappe Snowland, which I'll go on and say this is the better of the two snow levels we have in 64. So I wouldn't say this is the best snow track in the series. The layout's decent, and I do think the Mario snow sculpture is really cool. The snowmen are annoying, but they're honestly a pretty nice obstacle to have, especially now that we're starting to get to the harder levels in the game. But my biggest issue with this track is that the ending section is just kind of nothing. Like, it's really just kind of driving down this like snowy hallway. There's nothing really to look at. There's no real obstacles. I guess the only real saving grace about that section of the track is it's very easy for items to start building up in it. But I mean, when that's the only thing going for an entire like third of the track, it definitely degrades on the overall quality of it. The third track in this cup is essentially this game's equivalent of Choco Island. It is Choco Mountain, and this is also one of those weird tracks like Moo Moo Farm that I always remembered when I was younger, but overall it was just kind of a bland track. It's one where like when I got Mario Kart DS, I did recognize it, but over time it's just been like, yeah, I know what Choco Mountain is, but I don't really care that much about it. So as for some stuff I do like about this track, I do like the falling rock section towards the end. I think both visually and mechanically that adds a lot to the track, just because it's the one part of the track where you're not completely walled off on both sides, and also it actually provides some obstacles to avoid. And I do think the removal of the gates towards the end on higher CCs is funny as fuck, because if you fall off, it'll send you back to before the falling rock section, and that kind of shit is so funny to me. I love whenever Mario Kart tracks do that. It just adds so much chaos to the game, and I love it for that. So the final track of the Flower Cup is Mario Raceway, which obviously is this game's Mario circuit. Apparently this is the shortest track in Mario Kart 64, which I wouldn't have expected, because I don't know, maybe it's just because the layout's a lot more varied, but I always thought Luigi Raceway was a much shorter track than this. But with how short the track is, they do a lot of decent stuff with it. I think the layout's decently fun. I like the just overall aesthetics of it, that bend around the mushroom, driving through the pipe at the end. But overall, the track is still kind of in the middle of the list, if not closer to the bottom. Like, it's a decent track, but it's one of those ones where, with it being a Mario circuit, the aesthetics and really just overall track design just don't really stand out that much compared to other tracks in the game. Now that we're halfway through the list, we're gonna check out the battle tracks in Mario Kart 64. Starting off at number 4, we have Big Donut. It's a boring circle with lava in the middle. That's about it. The walls throughout the track are a neat little addition that kind of breaks up the overall circle of everything, but the stage is just way too linear outside of that. The hole in the middle is aesthetically cool, but it honestly detracts from the actual battles, since it now leaves a spot for items to just fall off and never like actually get a chance at doing anything. Like, high-key, green shells kinda suck on this stage. And really, if anything, the hole in the middle just lengthens battles because of that. Because now there's going to be less items on the battlefield, so there's less chance of someone getting hit. Overall, definitely one of the weaker battle tracks in the series, and easily the worst one in this game. At number 3, we have Skyscraper, which is aesthetically great, but kinda mid mechanically. The layout is much better than Big Donut, but overall it's still a little bit flat. I like the holes around it, and I do like those little sections kind of connecting the inner circle and the outer circle that are kind of walled off on the sides. I think that'll add a little bit more variety to the layout. And I do like how if you fall off, you're falling for like 12 years before Lakitu saves you. That shit is so funny to me, and we'll see that again later on in the list in another racetrack that I'll cover. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's the worst battle track ever, but it's definitely nowhere near the best. So at number 2, we have Double Deck, which I think is a very underrated battle track. It definitely needs to come back soon because it's the only N64 battle track that's never returned in any other game. Aesthetically, the track is pretty bland, there's really not much going on, but I think Double Deck does play really well. I love just the variation of the different levels that gives you a lot of places to kind of hide out, but also leaves a lot of opportunity to just like sneak up on someone. And I don't know, I think just overall this is a very well-designed battle stage that really deserves to be in a game with more players, because I do feel like 4 people on this stage might not be quite enough. And of course at number 1 it's Block 4. What else was I gonna put in number 1? It's the best in the game, it's one of the most popular for a very good reason. I love just the multiple levels of this one. There's the floor of it where it's basically just like the perimeter of a square with a little cross in the middle. I love the forts themselves, which in turn have 2 separate layers. So there's just a lot of variety, and not only are there all the layers on each individual fort, but each layer has a bridge connecting it to that layer on the next fort over, which, yeah, it just adds so much. It's just, they really knocked it out of the park with this battle stage. Like, if there was going to be any battle stage that was poised to come back in every single Mario Kart game, I think this one is 100% a top contender for that. And now that battle courses have been covered, let's get back to the cup ranking. So now that we're at number 2, I'm just going to go on and spoil that this game's cups just progressively get better than the last. So going off of that, number 2 is going to be the Star Cup. And this cup, again, just has a lot more variation than the previous cups. I think it does have lower lows than the Flower Cup, but the highs are much higher than either the Mushroom or the Flower Cup. So starting off, we have Wario Stadium, which of course is the only N64 racetrack that's never returned. I feel like that's just a point to mention until it comes back at this point. It's a very long track that really doesn't have a ton going on, but I do aesthetically like it, and I think it's a good setup for the stadium tracks we get later in the series. This track is one of those ones that I think suffers from not having the trick system in this game. I think Choco Mountain's another one of those, just backtracking there. But going by that, I think there's a lot of potential for a remake of this track later in the series. As far as the layout, there's really not much more than just like jumps in the ground that obviously you can't even trick on. The bigger jumps are nice little spectacles for the track, especially the one towards the end where you jump over a previous section of the track. But aside from that, there's not really a whole lot going on. That is, unless we talk about the wall glitch shortcut, which I'm sure many of you know about. And I remember specifically booting this game up on my Wii U and just spending a little while trying to just get this shortcut down. And I am happy I've memorized it, because genuinely, if you know how to do this shortcut, or you're playing with people who know how to do this shortcut becomes a requirement, because it cuts off so much track. It cuts off probably a solid third of the track, I'd say. And this is one of the things that makes me love Mario Kart 64, just because it's early enough in the series where we're not too polished yet. So it allows for a lot of really janky shortcuts like this, which does make me sad considering this obviously isn't going to be a thing whenever this track does finally return. So next up we have Sherbet Land, which is the other ice track in this game, and the one that I would most directly say is this game's Vanilla Lake. Like, take a look at this track and tell me this is not this. The overall design of this one feels very Vanilla Lake 2, but expanded upon very greatly. While I think this is one of the weaker tracks in the game, just from being a very sort of dreary feeling ice level, it has grown on me a lot over time. I've grown to really appreciate the layout of this track. I really enjoy the cave section with the penguins, and I don't know, the track honestly has become a lot more just fun for me to race on over time. This used to actually be one of the ones that I would rank at, like, close to the bottom of the series overall. And while it does still probably land somewhere around there for me, it's definitely gone up on my list over time. Overall, one of the weaker ones of this game, but still a very solid track. The third track in this cup is Royal Raceway, which, let me just get this out of the way, this is the best raceway in this game, and it's not even a contest. The layout is just so much more interesting, the aesthetics are much better with like the pink sky, which, I mean, I will say the pink sky and everything is a nice visual, but the visuals are kind of plain compared to some of the other 64 tracks even so. But the big jump towards the end is fun. I like, obviously, the section where you can just ride off the track and just go over to Peach's castle. This doesn't function as an actual part of the track in any way, which did confuse me for some reason when I was younger, because I remember getting 64 on my Wii Virtual Console, and one of the first times I played on Royal Raceway, and for some reason I was like, yep, this is part of the track, even though it clearly wasn't part of the main path. So I just like drove over there during an actual race and was like, where the fuck am I supposed to go? And genuinely don't know what was wrong with me at that time, because looking back, it's very obviously not supposed to be part of the track. It's very obviously not part of the main track, but I guess to some extent I can kind of see why, just because the road does kind of stick out compared to everything else. But yeah, aside from that, just very solid track overall. Moving on, we have this game's Bowser's Castle. Obviously the equivalent of the SNES Bowser Castles, and in this game it has become a series staple, although not in the cut placement we're usually used to now. This track does play better in future games, but it's still really fun here. The layout is very nice and twisted, and relative to a lot of the other tracks in this game, very difficult. As you'll see in this footage, I was just absolutely struggling on some of it, which I'll be honest, some of that was just me being stupid in the moment. But I think overall, like, there is some genuine difficulty to this track, and I really like it for that. There's a really nice use of thwomps, especially in that one section where if you're driving on the carpet, they will specifically fall in a place to block your path, which is insane looking back that they did that, but shit's funny anyway. And the end section of the track is really cool. I like how you can choose slightly different paths, one of which, if you drift just right, you can cut off a lot more of the turn than you would if you took the left path. And yeah, overall, just a really solid Bowser's Castle. I definitely see why this was the first 3D Bowser Castle to return in the series. And of course, in the number 1 spot, we have the Special Cup, which has some of the trickier tracks in this game. And overall, I think the aesthetics for these tracks are a lot more interesting. The layouts are very interesting. They do a lot of very unique stuff with these tracks. So to start off, we have DK Jungle Parkway, which is the first DK track in the series. And I'll be real, Donkey Kong tracks just don't usually miss. I think the weakest one is probably DK Pass, and even then that one's a pretty decent track. So, taking a look at this one, it's very fun to play in 64. The turns and shortcuts I thought were really satisfying. And I really like how when you go off the road in certain parts, you'll have these coconuts get thrown at you that'll slowly knock you back onto the road, which honestly genuinely helps with getting back onto the main road faster than just like the normal driving back. And I don't know, like, it's just a fun little unique detail of this track. I like the big jump over the river where you can see the little riverboat going under you. I like the cave section towards the end where you can take a shortcut up the wall and cut off a huge turn towards the end. And honestly, that shortcut was also really satisfying to pull off. Only thing is the music is just kind of like nothing. I don't even know how to explain it. I'm just gonna play a couple seconds of it because it's basically a loop of a couple seconds. It's like it barely qualifies as a song. So here we go. Like, I don't know, just kind of a nothing music track to be honest. But overall, one of the better tracks in this game for me. I would really love to see this track come back again later on. Next we have Yoshi Valley, which is easily the most unique track in this game. The main gimmick of this track is just the mass amounts of splitting pads, and I think they do a lot of really cool stuff with this concept, especially in later remakes of it, but as it is in this game, for one, there's the whole thing where you don't know what place you're in until you finish the race, which I know a lot of people will point out about this track. And I think, again, that adds a lot of that sort of Mario Kart chaos to the track. And as far as the splitting paths themselves, I do like how the fastest route to take is the hardest one to pull off, because you have to go through this very narrow, slightly bendy path that has 0 guardrails. So if you fall, then you're falling for like 3 years before you get picked back up, which can put you very far behind. And aside from that, the Yoshi egg at the end of the track is just a very fun, just iconic obstacle. Like, I definitely had played this track when I was younger, and it's just one of those ones where whenever I went back and saw like a Yoshi track, I was always looking for like the big egg that you had to avoid, just because that's the biggest thing I was remembering from this track, even as a kid. Just a really fun, just very unique track in general. Next up we have Banshee Boardwalk, which is this game's Ghost Valley equivalent, and this is the first Ghost track where I'm like, hell yeah, this is great. The layout's very fun, decently difficult for this game. I like that little dip in the track where the big fish jumps over you towards the beginning. I like the little sort of ruined castle, haunted house, whatever section that you go through at one point with all the bats flying towards you. And I don't know, I honestly hate that this one came back in DS, because this one honestly has some mad remake potential. Like, I could see them doing something like what they did with Boo Lake and Mario Kart 8. They can really spice up the layout even more and just turn this already great track into something phenomenal. And I don't know, this track I just feel like doesn't get talked about enough, because it's really one of the better ones in this game. And finally, of course, we have Mario Kart 64 Rainbow Road. And to start off, let's just go on and address the music, which is one of the most iconic Rainbow Road themes in the entire series. So much so that future Rainbow Road themes will incorporate it in some way for the most part. There's very few Rainbow Roads after this point that don't use the leitmotifs from this one. But on the negative side of this track, this one is just way too long and easy. The entire thing is guardrailed, which is honestly kinda unacceptable for a Rainbow Road if I'm being honest. Especially just coming off of a Rainbow Road where there were 0 guardrails and now we're having one where the entire thing has them. It's just like, I don't know what they were thinking. I think I get what they're going for as far as making this one feel less like a final challenge and more like a sort of victory lap, just celebrating getting to the end of the game. But I honestly, if they were going for something like that, I feel like it would honestly kind of work better if this track wasn't unlocked from the start of the game. I don't know. And in general, the track is just too long. On average, it takes you about 2 minutes to complete 1 lap, which means that an entire race on this can take 6 minutes. You could play just about an entire other cup in that time alone. It really should have been 2 laps, both in this version and the remake we'll get in the future. Because 3 laps is way too long, but 1 lap doesn't feel quite enough. The walls the whole time are very unnecessary, but if you can jump over them, then the track becomes slightly more interesting, because there is a shortcut right at the start of the race when the track does that really steep dip down. And if you jump to the left over the rails at just the right time, you're able to clear the gap and land on the track below and cut off the first little like loop or so of the track. But basically jump up to where section 2 begins in Mario Kart 8 roughly. And yet again, that's just another janky shortcut that's actively saving an otherwise way too long track. And I wouldn't say it saves it completely, considering there's still so much more track. Like, all in all, I think that shortcut only really saves about like 30 or so seconds off of a lap. But I do think it's worth bringing up as a point, because once you know how to do it, it does add a little bit more fun to this track. And on that somewhat underwhelming note, let's run through the proper rankings of each track. So at number 16, we have Luigi Raceway. Number 15, we have Sherbet Land. Number 14 is Moo Moo Farms. Number 13 is Mario Raceway. Number 12, Frappe Snowland. Number 11, Choco Mountain. Number 10, Rainbow Road. Number 9, Kalimari Desert. Number 8, Koopa Troopa Beach. Number 7, Toad's Turnpike. Number 6, Wario Stadium. Number 5, Royal Raceway. Number 4, Banshee Boardwalk. Number 3, Bowser's Castle. Number 2, DK's Jungle Parkway. And number 1 is Yoshi Valley. Overall, I think the tracks in this game are very solid. The tracks are more basic than a lot of their counterparts that you'll see later in the series, but they're all very iconic just for this being such a nostalgic game for a lot of people. The track designs start getting decently ambitious in this game, and I feel like that ambition goes up a lot more the further we get into the series. But even for now, like coming right off of Super Mario Kart, the tracks are very varied. We have a track where the primary gimmick is having like a million split pads. We have multiple tracks with giant jumps at some point in them. We have a whole stadium. We have a desert with an obstacle that can force you to intentionally stop for a couple seconds in a race. We have multiple very long tracks pushing the boundaries of how long a track in this series can be. And I think just the biggest takeaway with this game is that they're playing it safe, but at the same time kind of throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. Because we have a lot of very short tracks and a lot of very long tracks. We have ones with obstacles as the main gimmick, and we have ones where there's hardly any obstacles at all. There's very little consistency between the tracks themselves, but they all just work together in this way to make this just amazing racing game. And even though this is an improvement from Super Mario Kart, it's still nowhere near the best one in the series, and it's only gonna be up from here. Aside from if you don't like what's next, which is debatably a worse game than this one depending on who you talk to. We will see my opinions on that game in the next video. But for now, I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm still really happy to actually be doing this series, and anyone watching this, it means a lot to me that you're taking the time to actually just hear me out on my thoughts on these tracks, because I'm having a lot of fun just getting to talk about them. But until next time, I hope you guys like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys next time. Bye! This is one of those ones where it's basically the same on Wii, but I think by default it just goes like, oh my god, please. God, I'm not gonna use this after. Holy shit, hello? Huh? Hey, I'm just not gonna try drifting there. Damn.